Let's start with the person class from last time. Now, what would happen if I tried to compile it right now in my current situation? Actually, in particular in Dr. Java, it would give an error, and the reason is because I have this file open which contains the class person, and then I have the other file from last time which also contains the class person. And in Java, you're not allowed to have two classes of the same name in the same place. So basically, for example, right here we have person right here and person right here. Now in Dr. Java, the way projects are grouped is basically whatever is open is considered a project, so therefore we cannot have two persons classes in the same project, so therefore we just have to close one of them. In other environments, you may have to move this file to a new folder or like a new project. Now, here's an exercise. Create a class named limited group that contains instance variables person 1, person 2, and person 3, all of type person. And also create a constructor that sets the variables using parameters, and also create a method named display that this takes no parameters and displays or prints the information of every person in the group. And this is the person class. So how would we do this problem? Basically, we have class limited group that contains instance variables person 1, person 2, and person 3, all of type person. So how would we do this? Well, basically we have, since person, remember person is also a type, just like string and other types. So person, let's do person 1. Also remember we can make multiple variable declarations in one statement like this. You don't have to, but you can. Now create a constructor that sets the variables using parameters. So public limited group, remember the constructor name has to be the same, and parameters. Now, of course, we don't want to pass in the name, the email, the phone number, and the age for all three people, because that's going to be 12 parameters. You could do that, but that's messy. We could also just pass in people. So person P1, person P2, person P3. And note that right here we can do person, person 1, person 2, and person 3, but right here we cannot do that. We must have 3 persons because these aren't exactly the same thing as a variable declaration. They're parameters. And now, person 1 equals P1, person 2 equals P2, person 3 equals P3. Finally, method named display that takes no parameters and prints the information of every person in the limited group. So public void display. There's 2 options here. One option is just to print the information directly like that for every person. However, we notice that we've created this display method conveniently in our person class, so therefore we can use it. So all we'll have to do is person1.display, person2.display, person3.display, and then it would work. It would display the information of all three people, because that's how we programmed our display method. Now let's create one of these groups. So how would we do that? Well, first, in order for a group, we need people. Now that we have these three people, we can construct the group. So how would we do that? Well, just like the person, where we took a look at the parameters and matched the arguments with the parameters, with the group, we look at the parameters and match the arguments with the parameters. So put in stuff that matches. So first, just like person, limited group is also a type. Let's just call this LG equals new limited group, just like any other object, and then three people. So basically I can just pass in P1, P2, P3, and it would work. So lg.display, and all three people are displayed. And if we want, we can also create more limited groups. So for example, limited group lg2 equals new limited group. Let's just say we want new people. Now, another way of defining one of these groups is actually basically just directly calling the constructor of a person like this. And at first glance of this limited group construction seems like an entirely different format than the first one. However, upon a closer look, we see, first of all, the left side is the same format. The new limited group is the same. The only thing that's different is the arguments we put in. However, we realize this P1, basically P1 matches with person right here, the P1 there. P2 matches with this, and P3 matches with this. And over here we have this person, which I just construct. It's a person, it just doesn't have a specific variable name. And that matches with this. This matches with the parameter P2, and this matches with the parameter P3. And this group would work the same way. Now, suppose that I wanted 4 people in my group. Well, I could just add a variable, say person4, add a parameter, and then change my calling. Basically every time now it's 4 people. Now what if I wanted 5 people? Well, I would have to create another variable. There's another problem. What if I just want like 2 people, for example? Well, in this example, I'm not allowed to do that. I'm forced to provide a third person, which if I only have a 2-person group, that I would have to provide like a dummy person, which is not good. So therefore, we don't want this. This motivates the use of arrays. So basically, instead of having a group with 3 people, we have a group with an arbitrary amount of people. How do we do this? So first we need the class itself, so group. And now, our variable this time wouldn't be a person variable, it would be a person array variable. Like that. And then let's just call this the people. And of course we don't initialize the array because we don't know how many people are in the group until we construct the group. And now what about the constructor? So public group. Well, of course we would need parameters. In this case, let's just have a parameter that takes in a person array like that. And now people equals p. And there we go. Now all of a sudden, we have a group that can have an arbitrary amount of people. And in fact, we can even have the display method still. And how would we do this? We can just use a for loop. For every person in people, note that this p is different from that p. For every person p in the people, I just do p.display. That way it would display each individual person in the array, because that's how we program the display method in person. So now, for example, we could have something like person array people equals p1, p2, p3. And let's just say we wanted this person. And then I could just do group G, let's just say G1 equals, down here, what would we want to pass in? Well, we want to pass in a person array. So right here, new group, and then the person array. We could also make more groups. And this time, let's just say new person array of, let's just say we just want P2 and P3. We could also do that. And also the display methods would work, so g1.display would work, and for sake of demonstration, let's comment out these two for now. So g1.display works, g2.display works, as shown below. Now consider the following example. Just say we have a class named point in a two-dimensional plane. It basically has an x and y coordinate. And now let's make our constructor. And let's just say double x, double y. And now let's set the variables using the parameters, and you start to see a problem. So basically, we notice that x equals x and y equals y. Logically, that does nothing. And specifically, we notice that that's because we have an ambiguous x here and x here. So basically, now if we have, for example, let's just have a display method like that. And now let's go back up here and create a point. So like that. And now let's display the point. Point1.display. And we notice that something is off. It's 0.0, 0.0. And now what is off? This is what. Initially, we have x and y, which when defined are by default 0. That's the default value of all numerical primitive data types. And now we have double x right here. And the thing is, basically variables defined in a method kind of overwrite variables that are instance variables. They don't overwrite it so that the instance variables just completely disappear. It's just that whenever I say x, I'm referring to the parameter, not the instance variable. How do I solve this? There's two ways. One way, I name this xx and yy. So the parameters xx and yy. And now everything works. There's another way, which is basically do this dot x equals x and this dot y equals y. Basically, the logic behind this is that, remember, the dot means like the axis, so like remember 0.1 dot display means that the point does the display method. And for example, 0.1 dot x would be the x variable of 0.1. Same thing here. This dot x means the x variable of the current object that we're constructing. And then this dot y refers to the instance variable again. So whenever we have this dot a variable, it's always the instance variable. So therefore this would work because now this dot x is the instance variable and x is the parameter. And of course, don't get this mixed up. If you do something like x equals this dot x, for example, that's not going to work. In general, you're allowed to use this dot anytime, so like, for example, this dot display, that would call the display method. So for example, just as an exercise, what would that do? Well, actually now, when I run the program, it's actually going to display it twice. Now, why is that? It's because in point 1, when we construct the point 1, so new point right here, we called the display method, so therefore it displays it. So you are allowed to put print statements in the constructor, by the way. And you're also allowed to call methods in the constructor. Constructors, just like methods, are not limited to just assignment statements. You can also call other methods or print stuff. And then after I already displayed the point, I explicitly call point1.display again. Of course, this is just an example. It's not very applicable since you don't want to involuntarily display something. Another thing is that we don't need this dot display. Actually, we can just do display. Some people like putting this dot display because it shows that it's an instance method, but you could just do display like that. And of course, it would display it twice for the same reason we showed previously. Now, suppose that in this person class, we only have limited information. So for example, I want to construct the person, but I only know the name, but I don't know the email and phone number or age, for example. Well, sometimes I might not want to enter false information. So, in order to keep it more organized, I could do something like create another constructor. Basically, a class does not have to just have one constructor. It can have multiple constructors. So for example, public person takes a parameter for the name and sets the name, and then just sets, for example, email equals unknown, phone number equals unknown, age equals -1. Now the advantage to having this rather than having a client basically pass in false parameters is that now I have an organized way of knowing what basically unknown thing is. So now if, for example, I wanted to add a new feature in person, I would know that -1 would be the classic fault, like unknown age, and like unknown would be the classic unknown email, rather than dealing with the client's false information. Here's another example of where multiple constructors would be useful. Let's just say this group. Now, let's say I want explicitly a constructor that can take 3 people, because sometimes constructing an array can be annoying. Now, I could just do person P1, person P2, person P3 as parameters. And all I have to do now is people equals a new person because remember, I have to put new person array every time it's not a variable declaration statement. And I just put P1, P2, and P3 in there. Now, for example, I can create a group, G3, with 3 parameters rather than an array that contains 3 people, which is somewhat easier to construct. Of course, we'd still need the array for the general case, like what if we wanted 15 people, but it's nice to sometimes to have a more convenient constructor that's at hand if we need it. And we can do this like more times, like what if I just want a group with 2 people? Then people equals new person array that just contains P1 and P2. And it's much more convenient to just pass in 2 person parameters than to pass in an entire array. So sometimes you might want to use these constructors just for convenience. Now let's take another look at the 2 person constructors. We notice that the formats of these constructors are actually the same. Now, the thing about this is that we already know that methods can call other methods for convenience. So why not have a constructor that calls another constructor for convenience? So basically, we note that having a public person with just a name is equivalent to having the public person with the name, an unknown email, unknown phone number, and -1 age. So therefore, here's how we would call the other constructor. Basically, what we would have to do is this, except instead of dot or anything like that, just parentheses, indicating that we're calling the constructor. And then we put the right amount of parameters, the right types of parameters. So basically, for example, now n, because we want to set the name to n, then say unknown, unknown, and -1. And it would work just fine. Another thing to note about this is if I have a statement before this, it wouldn't work because as shown below, this call to this must be the first statement in the constructor. So basically, this must be the first statement in the constructor. We cannot have earlier statements. Of course, we're allowed to have comments because they're completely ignored, but we're not allowed to have other blocks. We're not allowed to have a statement or even a semicolon in general. And the person's other constructor would work just fine. As shown below, this information. Now, let's do some more practice with constructors. So consider these classes with these constructors. Remember, we could put constructors in one line because Java is not space sensitive. So now, what would new A do? First, are we allowed to do that? The answer is no. Why? Well, because A does not have an empty constructor. Therefore, we're not allowed to do that. Now, are we allowed to do something like new A5? Actually, it turns out yes. We don't need a variable like that. Of course, we can have a variable. It's still going to function normally. But just like a method, we don't have to set it to a variable. Even if the method itself returns something, we can just directly, just like methods with constructors, you can just directly call them without setting them to a variable. Of course, this has not a lot of applications, but it's just an example. So what would new A of 5 do? Well, 5 is passed into here, and it prints 5 times 5, which is 25. What about new a of 2 comma 1? So first 2 is passed into this constructor, and 1 is passed into this constructor as well. So a is 2, b is 1, a plus b is 3. So 3 is passed into the other constructor because we called it. So n is 3, n times n is 9. It's going to print 9. What about this? Is new b allowed? Actually, yes, because remember that when there is no constructor, by default, the constructor is just an empty constructor that takes no parameters and does nothing. Is new b with a parameter allowed? No. Just like new a without a parameter is not allowed either. We must match. What about, say, new c? Is that allowed? Yes, because, well, there is a constructor in C that has no parameters. What does that do? Well, let's take a look. New C, so first nothing is passed in, then this of QWERTY. So QWERTY is now, S is now QWERTY, and we're in this constructor, and we print QWERTY. Then afterward, we're done with the this call, so now we're down to printing ABC. So now prints QWERTY ABC. What about new C of ZXC? That would work. It's just going to print ZXC. Now, in these constructors, we're actually doing a lot of work that should be done in methods. And basically, this is just for practice, just to show how constructors work. But in general, basically, constructors shouldn't do this much work because, or like, there's not a lot of times where you would want a constructor to print something, for example, because constructors are just generating an object. You don't want it to involuntarily do something. And plus, methods are still useful because you want to be able to call them whenever you want, whereas a constructor, you would need to create a new object every time, which is sometimes inconvenient.